Have you ever wondered how many times a single life can break before it finally bends into something unrecognizable? I was only 10 years old when I first learned that families can collapse overnight, that stability is not promised, and that sometimes survival asks more of a child than of the adults in the room. I often ask myself even now, at 56, how much of the woman I became was shaped by those first cracks in the foundation? And how much of me still carries that scared little girl who refused to let the darkness win? My name is Grace Mitchell, and I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, a city that, much like me, has lived through collapse, reinvention, and endless struggle. Detroit in the 1970s was a place of noise and rhythm, the hum of assembly lines, the buzz of Motown drifting through radios, the clatter of families chasing the American dream in modest houses with peeling paint. My parents, William and Mary Mitchell, were part of that dream. My father worked in the auto factories, his hands always smelling faintly of oil and steel, while my mother managed the household with an iron will and a soft heart. For a while, we lived what felt like a steady life until the layoff notices began rolling through the neighborhoods like slow-moving storms. I was 10 when my father came home one afternoon. His face heavy, his lunch pail still full because he hadn't been able to stomach food. "They shut the line down," he told my mother, his voice stripped of the confidence I had always associated with him. That evening, I heard my parents whispering in the kitchen long after I was supposed to be asleep, their voices carrying both fear and determination. That was the first night I realized adults were not invincible. Fathers could lose their jobs and mothers could cry quietly over unpaid bills. The months that followed were filled with small humiliations I was too young to name. Neighbors who once waved stopped making eye contact. My father stood in long lines at the unemployment office, shoulders hunched, his pride thinning with each passing week. My mother stretched every dollar, turning dinners into feasts of creativity, potatoes cooked in every imaginable way, bread pudding from stale loaves, watered-down milk that she called diet milk to make us laugh. We survived, but the laughter in our home grew thinner, like fabric worn down to its threads. For me, the burden came in ways a 10-year-old shouldn't have known. I started babysitting for neighbors, running errands, and later, at 12, folding newspapers at dawn to bring in a few extra dollars. I still remember the sting of winter mornings, my fingers numb as I tossed papers onto porches, telling myself this was what responsibility looked like. My friends at school talked about sleepovers and birthday parties. I thought about overdue bills and whether my father would find steady work again. Childhood, for me, ended in those moments, not with a bang, but with the slow erosion of innocence. By the time I was 16, my father was still bouncing between temporary jobs, never finding the stability he once had. My mother, tired but unyielding, worked part-time in a diner, her hands red from washing dishes. I contributed what I could from small retail jobs, standing on aching feet after school shifts at the corner store. But somewhere in me, a seed had been planted, the belief that I could not rely on anyone else to save me, not even my parents. That belief would shape every choice I made in adulthood, for better and for worse. High school was a blur of exhaustion and longing. I loved learning, but homework was often done under dim lights after closing shifts. Teachers told me I had potential, but potential doesn't pay bills. Still, I pushed through, graduating by sheer force of will. College was out of reach financially, though I dreamed of it. Instead, I moved from one low-paying job to another, always trying to find the crack in the wall that might lead to a better life. At 21, I met Thomas. He was charming, older by a few years, and carried himself with the kind of confidence I mistook for security. After years of instability, he felt like an anchor. We married when I was 23, and for a while, I convinced myself I had finally stepped into the stability I had craved since childhood. We had 2 children, Emily and Aaron, and I poured everything into being the kind of mother who would give them the safety I never had. I worked part-time clerical jobs, balancing diapers, bills, and the dream of a better tomorrow. But Thomas was not the anchor I thought he was. Slowly, I began to notice the cracks, the late nights, the evasive answers, the emotional distance. By the time I was 35, the truth could no longer be ignored. He was cheating. I can still recall the night I found the hotel receipt in his jacket pocket, the casual cruelty of his lies when I confronted him. Betrayal cuts deeper when it comes from the person you trusted to guard your heart. My parents had failed me in some ways, but Thomas's betrayal felt like a deliberate wound. Divorce at that time felt like stepping off a cliff. I was judged by neighbors, pitied by some, ignored by others. I was raising two children on my own, working long hours in uninspiring jobs, and carrying the weight of shame that society often places on divorced women. But in that darkness, something inside me hardened not into bitterness, but into resolve. I refused to let Thomas's betrayal define the rest of my story. I took night classes in administration, slowly building skills that would eventually open doors to better paying work. I learned to balance a checkbook with precision, to stretch every dollar without apology, and most importantly, to raise my children with the resilience I had inherited from my own mother. By the time I was 40, I thought I had finally built a foundation strong enough to stand on. But life, as it often does, had another test waiting for me. Detroit winters had a way of making time feel heavier. After the divorce, every day felt like walking through a fog that refused to lift. In my journal, I kept describing it as living inside a windowless room, no light, no doors. Just me and the weight of loss. I woke up to silence that didn't feel peaceful, but suffocating. The chair at the kitchen table across from me stayed empty, the mail piled up, and the house seemed to echo with an absence I could neither explain nor ignore. Bills arrived in neat white envelopes, cruel in their consistency. The mortgage, utilities, medical costs, every slip of paper reminded me that survival was no longer automatic. There were nights when I chose between paying the gas bill and buying Emily's school books. I sold things that once held meaning, my favorite novels, small souvenirs from family trips, even my wedding ring, just to keep the lights on. It felt like bartering away pieces of my life for scraps of stability. But the financial strain wasn't the only weight I carried. Inside, I was collapsing. Depression crept in quietly, a constant whisper tallying every failure, every rejection, every wound. I asked myself questions that cut deep. Am I enough? Have I failed not just myself, but my children too? Some days I barely had the strength to get out of bed, my mind pulling me back into darkness. Yet no matter how heavy it got, the faces of my children, those hopeful, trusting eyes, kept me moving. It was Aaron who first noticed how far I had sunk. One evening he sat beside me and said, "Mom, you don't have to do this alone." His words were gentle and they pierced straight through the fog. The next week, I booked my first therapy session. Sitting in that therapist's office felt like standing trial for my own emotions. Saying my pain out loud was harder than I imagined. But session by session, the fortress around my grief began to soften. My therapist introduced me to meditation. "Just focus on your breath," she said. At first, I bristled. Breathing? That's supposed to fix me? But slowly, something shifted. Each morning, I carved out a few minutes in the corner of my living room, closed my eyes, and breathed. Detroit's noise hummed outside, traffic, sirens, the city's endless rush, but inside. For those moments, I felt still. I started noticing my thoughts without letting them consume me. I learned that healing wasn't erasing pain. It was carrying it without letting it crush me. The kids saw the changes. The heaviness in my eyes lifted, little by little. One afternoon, Emily said, "Mom, remember how you used to make things with your hands? Maybe you could do that again." The suggestion lingered like a spark waiting for oxygen. I remembered. As a child, I sewed clothes for my dolls, folded paper into little houses, and made crafts out of scraps. Those forgotten joys began tugging at me. I rummaged through the attic and found my old sewing machine, the cover dusty but intact. Tentatively, I began to sew again, first a scarf, then a simple dress. The sound of the needle-piercing fabric became a rhythm, like my heartbeat finding its way back. Encouraged, I took a leap. At a local community market, I set up a small stall with handmade scarves and crafts. My hands trembled as I arranged them, terrified no one would stop to look. When the first woman picked up a scarf and said, "This feels made with love," something inside me cracked open. That scarf wasn't just fabric, it was hope stitched together. Emily became my social media lead. "We'll show people what you're making," she said, determined. Aaron helped me budget, price items, and even do deliveries when orders began to trickle in. They weren't just my children, they became my team, my support system, my safety net. I launched a small Etsy shop and started with candles, scarves, and handmade jewelry. At first, orders were sporadic. Some weeks were discouraging, customers complained about prices, some designs didn't sell. And I lay awake wondering, what if this is just a distraction? What if I'm setting myself up to fail again? Each time doubt crept in, I returned to therapy's lessons. Healing wasn't about never falling. It was about choosing to get back up. I meditated, I journaled, and most importantly, I created. With each order, my confidence grew. Reviews were warm and specific. This candle made my home feel cozy again. The attention to detail is incredible. I realized I wasn't just selling crafts, I was sending pieces of my heart into the world. Not everyone understood. One evening, Thomas called to check on the kids and ended up questioning my choices. "Are you sure this is what you want to be doing?" he asked, skepticism threading his voice. "You're pouring everything into something that could fall apart tomorrow. What happens then?" My hands were shaking, but my voice stayed steady. "I've asked myself that 100 times. I can't live in fear anymore. This isn't just about money, it's about proving to myself that I still matter. That I can still create something worthwhile." For once, he didn't argue. His silence on the other end felt strangely like respect. I doubled down on learning. I signed up for online classes in social media marketing, customer relations, and small business management. I experimented with organic skincare, bath salts, and custom crafts, slowly shaping a brand that felt like me. The Etsy shop grew. Orders came from outside Michigan, from Chicago, New York, even California. Each package I wrapped in tissue paper felt like a message: you are not broken. You are building again. By year's end, my little shop was covering more than bills. It was covering my spirit. I was no longer the woman defined by loss, betrayal, or depression. I was the woman who took broken pieces and built something new through it all. My children stood beside me. Aaron joked, "Mom, you're the CEO now." Emily posted photos of my crafts with captions like, "Proud of my mom, the strongest woman I know." I often looked in the mirror, studying the lines on my face. They weren't just signs of age, they were a survivor's roadmap. I had lost, I had broken, I had been betrayed, but I had never truly given up. And now, I was remembering how to live, not just survive. My story was still unfolding, but for the first time in years, I felt in control of the pen. Asterisk by the time I turned 55. Detroit felt different to me, not because the city had changed, but because I had. The same streets that once reminded me of struggle now reminded me of survival. The same skyline that once looked like walls now looked like possibility. I had walked through storms and somehow still found my way back to the light. My little Etsy shop had grown far beyond what I once imagined. What began as scarves and candles blossomed into something bigger. A full brand with a loyal community. I no longer just sold products. I told stories through them. Every candle carried a name tied to a memory. Every scarf held patterns that represented resilience, hope, or healing. Customers didn't just buy my items, they connected with them. They wrote to tell me how my work comforted them through grief, inspired them in hard times, or simply brought beauty back into their homes. I became more than a craftswoman. I became a storyteller, stitching my life into every piece I created. And the world responded, yet success didn't erase my challenges. Running a business was still hard. There were late nights when I packed orders until my hands ached. Mornings when I faced supply shortages, and months when profit margins barely covered expenses. But I'd learned a crucial lesson: failure was no longer my enemy. I didn't fear it anymore. If something didn't work, I adjusted, experimented, and tried again. I lived by the mantra I once told my son when he fell off his bike: "We'll try again tomorrow." With Band-Aids, my children remained my constant supporters. Aaron, now in his 30s, took the technical lead. He built a clean website, managed digital ads, and even set up a candle subscription model. Emily, a young professional with a brilliant eye, shaped the branding and visuals, giving my products a polished, unmistakable look. Together, the three of us built something stronger than a business. It became a family legacy, a reflection of our bond. But the true change in this chapter wasn't just the business, it was me. Depression still lingered at the edges sometimes, but I met it differently. I practiced meditation at sunrise when the world felt quiet. I journaled about fears, hopes, and gratitude. I booked therapy sessions when I felt myself slipping, refusing to let silence swallow me again. I wasn't ashamed of needing help anymore. I wore it like a badge of courage. Healing wasn't weakness, it was strength. At 56, I often found myself standing in my small studio, a place I once feared I'd never afford, but now rented proudly. The room smelled of lavender bundles drying on the wall, and the soft hum of a sewing machine filled the air. Outside, Detroit bustled. Inside, time felt sacred. One afternoon, Emily stopped by with coffee, her eyes sparkling as she handed me a folded magazine. I took it with curiosity and saw my own face on the page. A feature on local entrepreneurs highlighting women who rebuilt their lives after hardship. The headline read, "Grace Mitchell, from broken pieces to beautiful beginnings." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had spent years believing my story was one of loss, betrayal, and survival, but here it was reframed as strength, resilience, and triumph. I pressed my hand against the page, tears burning my eyes. "I don't even recognize that woman," I whispered. Emily smiled. "That's because you still see the old you. The rest of us see her." I laughed through tears, realizing how true that was. For so long, I defined myself by what went wrong. But the people around me, my children, my customers, even strangers who read my story, saw someone who had risen, not someone who had fallen. Later that evening, Aaron joined us for dinner. We sat around the same table that once felt too empty, now alive with conversation and warmth. We toasted not to wealth or success, but to endurance. Aaron raised his glass and said, "Here's to Mom, the woman who taught us that broken doesn't mean finished." His words echoed in my heart long after the glasses clinked. Life had taken so much from me, but it had also given me the chance to rebuild. I wasn't the woman who once cried in a grocery store parking lot, unsure of her future. I was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had earned every line on my face, of course. Betrayal still haunted my memories: Thomas's infidelity, the lies from people I trusted, the sting of abandonment. But I no longer carried those as open wounds. I carried them as scars, marks that told the story of a battle survived. I learned that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant refusing to let the past dictate my future. As I walked through Detroit one chilly evening, the city lights flickering against the river, I thought about the girl I once was, the 10-year-old who dreamed of a better life, the 40-year-old who thought betrayal had broken her forever, and the 53-year-old who thought a layoff meant the end of her worth. All those versions of me live inside me still, but none of them define me. I am Grace Mitchell, 56 years old, and I am still here, still fighting, still creating, still loving. And perhaps that is the greatest victory of all, not the money I earn or the recognition, but the simple fact that I never let life defeat me. My story is proof that even when everything goes wrong, when betrayal cuts deep, when depression tries to consume you, when stability shatters, you can still rise. Not perfectly, not without scars, but rise nonetheless. That night, as I closed my studio and walked home, I whispered a quiet promise to myself: this is not the end. My story isn't finished yet. And as long as I have breath, I will keep writing it.